Look, I've been a cop for 11 years now, and I've seen some weird stuff. Domestic calls where people are so high they think their furniture is talking to them. Bar fights that spill out into the street with grown men acting like animals. Hell, I once had to chase down a guy who was convinced he was a vampire and tried to bite 3 people at a gas station. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened that October night 3 years ago. I still wake up sometimes, sweating through my sheets, thinking about those eyes staring back at me in the beam of my flashlight. The way it looked at me like it was deciding whether I was worth killing or not. I should probably start from the beginning. It was a Thursday night, sometime around 11:30. I was working the night shift in our county, which covers a lot of rural farmland and thick forest. Most of the calls we get are pretty routine: drunk drivers, domestic disputes, the occasional break-in, the kind of stuff you expect in an area where people live miles apart and sometimes have too much time to drink and think about their problems. My partner had called in sick that day with some stomach bug, so I was riding solo. Normally, that wouldn't bother me much. After 11 years on the force, you get comfortable handling most situations by yourself. Plus, our county is pretty quiet most nights. The worst thing that usually happens is someone's cow gets loose and wanders onto the highway. I was sitting in my cruiser at the all-night diner, finishing up some paperwork and drinking what had to be my 4th cup of coffee when the call came in. The dispatcher's voice crackled through the radio with that tone that immediately gets your attention. You know the one, when something's not quite right, but they're trying to stay professional about it. She said there was a domestic disturbance call at a farmhouse about 15 miles out on County Road 47. The address she gave me made my heart sink a little. That's way out in the sticks, where the houses are spread so far apart that your nearest neighbor might be 2 miles away. When things go bad out there, they can go really bad really fast because nobody's around to help. But what really caught my attention was what the dispatcher said next. She told me the woman who called 911 was screaming about something huge outside their house. Not someone, something. The call kept cutting out, and she could hear glass breaking in the background before the line went dead. Now, when you hear something like that, your mind immediately goes to the worst-case scenarios. Maybe there's an intruder with a weapon. Maybe someone's having a psychotic break and thinks they're seeing monsters. Or maybe it's just another meth head who's been up for 3 days straight and is hallucinating. You see that more than you'd think. I radioed back that I was responding and started making the drive out there. County Road 47 is one of those winding country roads that snakes through some of the thickest forest in our area. During the day, it's actually pretty scenic. At night, especially on a moonless night like this one, those trees seem to close in around you like tunnel walls. The further I drove, the more spaced out the houses became. First, you pass a few newer developments where people from the city moved out to have more space. Then you get to the older farmhouses, some of them dating back 60 or 70 years, sitting on plots of land that stretch back into the woods for acres and acres. The address I was looking for turned out to be at the end of a long dirt road that branched off from the main county road. My headlights cut through the darkness as I bumped along the rutted path, tree branches scraping against the sides of my cruiser. The road curved and twisted for what felt like a mile before I finally saw lights up ahead. But about halfway down that dirt road, something made me slow down and really pay attention. My headlights caught something white hanging from a tree branch about 20 feet ahead. Looked like torn fabric fluttering in the breeze. When I got closer, I could see it was a piece of a white t-shirt hanging about 8 feet off the ground, like something had ripped it off and it got caught on the branch. That struck me as odd. The branch it was hanging from was way too high for a person to reach, even jumping. And it was fresh. The fabric was clean and hadn't been weathered by rain or sun. I made a mental note to ask the residents about it. A little further down the road, my headlights picked up scratch marks on the bark of several trees. deep gouges running vertically down the trunks, like claw marks, but bigger than anything I'd seen before. Some of them were 10 feet off the ground. I've seen what bear claws can do to trees, and this wasn't it. These marks were too deep, too deliberate, and way too high up. The farmhouse sat in a clearing surrounded by dense forest on 3 sides. It was one of those old 2-story places that had probably been built sometime in the 1950s, with white wooden siding and a wraparound porch. There were lights on in several windows, which was actually reassuring at first. If someone was in immediate danger, you'd expect the house to be dark. But as I got closer, I noticed something that made me slow down and really look at the scene. The front door was standing wide open, not just unlocked, completely open, with the screen door hanging off its hinges like something had ripped right through it. I parked the cruiser in the gravel driveway and sat there for a moment, taking everything in. The house was completely silent, no sounds of arguing, no screaming, no music or television, just dead silence, which is actually more unsettling than noise would have been. When people call 911 about a disturbance and you show up to complete silence, that usually means one of 2 things. Either the problem resolved itself or it got much worse. As I sat there, I noticed something else that didn't seem right. The windows facing the driveway had what looked like mud smeared on them, but when I got out and looked closer with my flashlight, I could see they weren't random smears. They looked like handprints, but bigger than any human hand should be. Some of them were positioned so high on the windows that whoever made them would have had to be at least 7 or 8 feet tall. I grabbed my flashlight and got out of the car, immediately noticing how quiet everything was. I mean, completely quiet. No wind in the trees, no insects, no night birds, nothing. It was like the whole forest was holding its breath. Even the gravel under my feet seemed to make too much noise in that silence. I called out toward the house, identifying myself as police and asking if anyone was home. My voice seemed to get swallowed up by the silence. No response from inside, but I could swear I heard something move in the trees behind the house. Just a faint rustling, like something large shifting its weight from one foot to another. Standard procedure in a situation like this is to approach carefully and try to make contact with the residents. You never know what you're walking into, especially when there's evidence of forced entry or a struggle. I kept my hand near my service weapon and made my way up the front steps. The first thing that hit me when I reached the porch was the smell. It was like nothing I'd ever encountered before. A thick, musky odor that reminded me of wet dog mixed with something else I couldn't identify. Something wild and animal-like, but stronger than any normal animal I'd ever smelled. It was so strong it almost made me gag, and it seemed to be coming from inside the house. I shined my flashlight through the open doorway into the living room. What I saw made me freeze for a second. The place was completely torn up. An old leather recliner was overturned, a coffee table was smashed into pieces, and there was a broken lamp scattered across the hardwood floor. But it wasn't just destroyed, it looked like something had gone into a rage in there. Deep scratches in the wooden walls, throw pillows ripped apart with stuffing scattered everywhere. But what really got my attention were the footprints. Muddy prints tracked across the floor from the front door toward the back of the house. At first glance, they looked almost human, but when I got down and really examined them with my flashlight, I could see they were way too big. We're talking footprints that had to be at least 14 or 15 inches long and wider than any human foot I'd ever seen. The depth of the impressions in the mud suggested whatever made them was incredibly heavy. What made it even weirder was that there were only the large prints, no human footprints mixed in, no signs that anyone had tried to run or fight back in this room. Just those massive tracks leading deeper into the house. I called out again, louder this time, asking if anyone was in the house and needed help. That's when I heard it, a faint whimpering sound coming from somewhere upstairs. It sounded like someone crying or maybe praying. And underneath that, what sounded like two people whispering urgently to each other. I drew my weapon and made my way through the house, checking each room as I went. The kitchen was a disaster area. Chairs were scattered everywhere. Cabinet doors were hanging open, and there were muddy handprints on the walls. But again, these weren't normal handprints. They were huge, with fingers that had to be twice as long as mine, and some of them were positioned 8 feet up the wall. But what really disturbed me was what I found on the kitchen counter. There were several pieces of raw meat, looked like steaks or roasts, that had been pulled out of the refrigerator and just left there. They looked like they'd been handled, squeezed maybe, because there were clear impressions of those same large fingers pressed into the raw beef, like something had picked them up, examined them, and then lost interest. The whimpering was getting louder as I made my way upstairs. It was coming from what looked like the master bedroom at the end of the hall. The door was closed, so I announced myself again and slowly pushed it open. The bedroom looked like someone had barricaded themselves inside. The dresser had been shoved against the door, and when I moved it aside, I found an elderly couple huddled together in the walk-in closet. They were both probably in their 70s, and they were absolutely terrified. The woman was shaking so badly she could barely speak, and the man kept looking toward the window like he expected something to come crashing through it. I holstered my weapon and tried to calm them down, but they were both in shock. The woman kept repeating the same thing over and over. It was looking through our window. It was looking right at us. She'd point toward the bedroom window and then hide her face against her husband's shoulder. The man was a little more coherent. He told me they'd been watching television downstairs when they heard something moving around outside the house. At first, they thought it might be a bear getting into their garbage cans. They'd had problems with bears before, especially during drought years when natural food sources were scarce. But then whatever it was started pounding on the walls of the house, not scratching like an animal would do, but deliberately pounding with what sounded like fists. The man said he went to the front window to look outside, and that's when he saw it. According to him, the thing was enormous, standing upright like a man but at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark brown fur or hair. He said its face looked almost human, but wrong somehow, like an ancient caveman with intelligent eyes that reflected light like an animal's. The woman managed to call 911, but while she was on the phone, the creature came around to the back of the house and started looking through their bedroom window. She said it pressed its face against the glass, and she could see its breath fogging up the window. That's when they grabbed a few things and locked themselves in the closet. I helped them get to their feet and told them I was going to check the rest of the house to make sure it was secure. The man grabbed my arm and told me the thing was still outside somewhere. He'd heard it moving around the property while they were hiding. I left them in the bedroom and went back downstairs to investigate. The back door was still locked, but when I examined it with my flashlight, I could see gouges in the wood around the frame, like something with very large claws had been trying to get inside. The scratches were deep enough that I could stick my finger into some of them. What really unnerved me was what I found next to the back door. There was a wooden porch chair that had been completely destroyed. Not just broken, but literally torn apart like someone had grabbed it and pulled it to pieces with their bare hands. The wooden pieces were scattered across the patio, and some of the larger chunks had been thrown against the side of the house with enough force to leave dents in the siding. That's when I decided to check the outside of the house. I stepped out the back door onto a small patio and immediately saw what the couple had been talking about. There were massive handprints on the outside of several windows, some of them 8 feet off the ground. Whatever had made them would have had to be incredibly tall to reach that high. But these weren't just random prints. They were positioned deliberately, like something had been moving from window to window, looking inside the house. I could trace a path around the entire house just by following the handprints. Whatever this thing was, it had circled the house multiple times, examining every window and door. I was examining one of the handprints when I heard heavy footsteps in the tree line behind the house. Not the quick, light steps of a deer or the shuffling of a bear, but deliberate, measured footsteps like something large walking on two legs. The sound was getting closer, and I could hear branches breaking as whatever it was pushed through the underbrush. I turned my flashlight toward the sound and caught a glimpse of something dark moving between the trees. It was only for a second, but I could see it was huge and upright. When my light hit it, it seemed to pause for a moment, and I swear I could see two eyes reflecting the light back at me. Then it disappeared deeper into the forest, but I could still hear it moving, deliberately staying just out of range of my flashlight. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were more of those massive footprints in the mud around the house, but they weren't all the same size. Some were larger than others, suggesting there might be more than one of these creatures. The prints formed a rough circle around the house, like multiple creatures had been surrounding the building. My first thought was that I needed to call for backup immediately. Whatever was out there was definitely not normal, and I wasn't equipped to handle it by myself, especially if there were multiple creatures. I went back inside and tried to reach dispatch on my radio, but all I got was static. The radio had been working fine on my drive out there, but now it was completely dead. I tried my cell phone, but there was no signal. That wasn't unusual in this part of the county. The mountains and thick forest made cell coverage spotty at best, but the timing made me nervous. It felt like I was being cut off from the outside world right when I needed help the most. I was standing in the kitchen, trying different channels on my radio and holding my phone up to see if I could get even one bar of signal when I heard something that made me freeze. It was a sound I'd never heard before. A low, rumbling vocalization that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. It wasn't quite howling and wasn't quite speech, but something in between, like several large creatures were communicating with each other in the darkness outside. The sound seemed to go on forever, echoing through the forest around the house. When it finally stopped, the silence that followed was even more unsettling than the noise had been. That's when something came crashing through the back window. A rock about the size of a football sailed through the glass and landed on the kitchen floor, surrounded by shards. The sound was so loud and sudden that I actually jumped and drew my weapon. But what really got to me was the precision of the throw. The rock had come through the center of the window, not the bottom or side like you'd expect if an animal had accidentally knocked something through it. This was a deliberate aim throw. Upstairs, I could hear the couple screaming. They must have heard the crash and thought whatever was outside was finally getting into the house. I could also hear something pounding on the exterior walls, like someone hitting the side of the house with a baseball bat. But the sound was coming from different locations. First the back of the house, then the side, then the front. Like multiple creatures were coordinating an attack on the building. The pounding got louder and more aggressive. I could hear the house creaking under the impact, and I started to worry that whatever was out there might actually be able to break through the walls. The elderly couple upstairs were screaming constantly now, and I knew I had to do something before they went into shock or had heart attacks from the terror. That's when I made the decision that still haunts me. I knew I couldn't wait for backup that might not even be coming. There was an elderly couple upstairs who were scared out of their minds, and there was clearly something outside that was aggressive and getting bolder. As a police officer, my job was to protect those people, regardless of what I was up against. I checked my service weapon to make sure I had a full magazine, took a deep breath, and went back outside. The pounding on the walls had stopped and everything was quiet again. But it was a different kind of quiet now, not the natural silence of the forest, but the tense quiet you get when predators are watching prey. I could feel eyes on me from the darkness, even though I couldn't see anything. I moved slowly around the side of the house, my flashlight in one hand and my gun in the other, checking every shadow and listening for any sound that might give away the location of whatever was out there. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure anything hiding in the trees could hear it. I made it about halfway around the house before I saw it. The thing was standing next to an old barn about 50 yards away from the house. When my flashlight beam hit it, it didn't run or hide like a normal animal would. Instead, it turned and looked directly at me. I've seen bears, deer, coyotes, and every other kind of wildlife you can imagine, and they all react the same way to a bright light. They either freeze like a deer in headlights or they bolt immediately. This thing did neither. It looked at me with what I can only describe as intelligence. Like it was studying me, trying to figure out what I was going to do next. It was exactly like the old man had described it, but somehow worse in person. Enormous, at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark, matted fur that seemed to absorb the light from my flashlight. But seeing it in person was completely different from hearing about it. The sheer size of the creature was overwhelming. Its shoulders were broader than any human's, and its arms were longer than they should have been, hanging down past where its knees would be. But it was the face that really got to me. It wasn't quite human and wasn't quite animal. The features were too large and pronounced to be human, but there was definitely intelligence behind those eyes. It was looking at me the way a person would look at you, not the way an animal looks at a potential threat. There was calculation there, like it was deciding what to do about me. What made it even more terrifying was how still it was. Most animals, even large predators, have some kind of nervous energy when they encounter humans. They shift their weight, flick their ears, move their heads. This thing was perfectly motionless except for its eyes, which tracked my every movement. I did what I was trained to do. I raised my weapon and shouted for it to stop and stay where it was. I know it sounds ridiculous, giving commands to something that obviously wasn't going to understand English, but training kicks in during high-stress situations and you fall back on what you know. The creature didn't run. That's what really unnerved me. A bear or any other wild animal would have taken off immediately when confronted by a human with a loud voice and a bright light. This thing just stood there watching me like it was evaluating the threat I represented. Then it started walking toward me, not running or charging, but walking with slow, deliberate steps. As it got closer, I could hear it making low sounds in its throat, almost like growling, but more complex than that. It sounded almost like it was trying to communicate something, but the tone was definitely threatening. I backed up toward the house, keeping my weapon trained on the creature, and shouted for it to stop again. It ignored me completely and kept coming. With each step, I could see more details that made the whole situation even more surreal. Its hands were massive, easily twice the size of human hands, with fingers that looked strong enough to crush bone. Its legs were thick and muscular, built for power rather than speed. But what really terrified me was how human its gait was. It wasn't lumbering like a bear or moving with the careful steps of an animal navigating unfamiliar territory. It walked like a person who knew exactly where they were going and what they planned to do when they got there. That's when I noticed it was moving toward a piece of old farm equipment that was sitting in the yard. A heavy metal plow that probably weighed a couple 100 pounds. I realized with growing horror that the creature wasn't just approaching me randomly. It had a destination and a purpose. The creature reached down and picked up the plow like it was made of cardboard. It lifted the entire thing over its head with what appeared to be no effort at all, holding it there like it was preparing to throw it or use it as a club. That's when I realized this wasn't just some curious animal wandering through the property. This thing was preparing to attack me, and it was smart enough to use a weapon to do it. I had maybe 2 seconds to make a decision. The creature was about 20 feet away from me, holding a piece of farm equipment that could easily kill me if it decided to throw it or use it as a weapon. An elderly couple was counting on me to protect them, and I was the only thing standing between them and this creature. In that split second, time seemed to slow down. I could see every detail of the thing's face in my flashlight beam. The way its nostrils flared as it breathed, the intelligence in its dark eyes, the deliberate way it adjusted its grip on the plow to get better leverage. This wasn't a mindless animal acting on instinct. This was something that understood cause and effect, something that had made a conscious decision to threaten me with a weapon. I fired 3 shots center mass. The sound of the gunshots echoed across the clearing like thunder, and for a moment, everything was completely still. The creature dropped the plow, which hit the ground with a metallic crash that seemed to go on forever. It staggered backward, looking down at its chest with what I can only describe as shock and confusion. Then it looked back at me, and the expression on its face changed completely. The intelligence was still there, but now it was mixed with something else. Pain, anger, and what almost looked like betrayal. Like it couldn't believe I had actually heard it. The creature reached up and touched its chest where my bullets had hit, then looked at its hand. Even in the beam of my flashlight, I could see dark liquid on its fingers. Blood. I had definitely hit it, but it was still standing, still conscious, still looking at me with those unnervingly human eyes. Then it let out a sound that I still hear in my nightmares. It wasn't quite a roar and wasn't quite a scream. It was something primal and angry and hurt all at the same time. The sound seemed to come from deep in its chest and was so loud that I felt it in my bones. It was a sound of pain, but also of rage, like the creature was promising that this wasn't over between us. The creature turned and ran toward the tree line, but not like a wounded animal would run. It moved with purpose, crashing through bushes and small trees like they weren't even there. I could hear it moving through the forest, breaking branches and stumbling as it went, but the sounds were getting fainter as it put distance between us. But what really made my blood run cold was what happened next. Other voices answered from deep in the woods, more of those same unearthly howling sounds coming from different directions all around the house. There wasn't just one of these things, there were more of them out there, and they'd heard the gunshots and their companions' cry of pain. The howling went on for what felt like minutes, echoing back and forth across the forest like some kind of primitive communication system. I could count at least 4 or 5 distinct voices, some closer than others, but all of them sounding angry and agitated. Whatever I had shot wasn't alone, and now the rest of them knew there was a threat in their territory. I immediately went back into the house and tried my radio again. Suddenly, it was working perfectly, like whatever had been interfering with the signal had stopped. I called for backup and an ambulance, telling dispatch I'd had to fire my weapon during the disturbance call and that I needed multiple units and medical personnel to respond immediately. The dispatcher asked me if anyone was injured, and I honestly didn't know how to answer. I'd shot something, and it was definitely bleeding, but I couldn't exactly tell her I'd shot at a creature that shouldn't exist. I told her I wasn't sure about injuries, but that the situation was potentially dangerous, and I needed backup as soon as possible. While I waited for backup to arrive, I went upstairs to check on the elderly couple. They were still in the bedroom, but they'd heard the gunshots and were even more terrified than before. The woman kept asking me if I'd killed it, and the man wanted to know if it was safe to come out of hiding. I told them I'd shot at something that was threatening us, but I wasn't sure if it was dead or just wounded. I advised them to stay upstairs until backup arrived and the area was secure. The last thing I wanted was for them to come downstairs and potentially encounter whatever I'd wounded if it decided to come back. I went back outside to follow the blood trail, but I was careful to stay close to the house. There were definitely drops of dark blood on the ground leading from where I'd shot the creature to the edge of the forest. The blood looked almost black in my flashlight beam, thicker than human blood, and there was more of it than I'd expected. The trail was easy to follow for the first 50 yards or so. I could see where the creature had stumbled and fallen at least twice, leaving larger pools of blood on the ground. There were also broken branches and trampled vegetation showing the path it had taken through the underbrush. But I wasn't about to follow that trail into the woods by myself, especially knowing there were more of those things out there. The howling had stopped, but the silence that followed was almost worse. I had the distinct feeling I was being watched from multiple directions, like the other creatures were positioned in the trees around the house, deciding what to do about the human who had hurt one of their own. The first backup unit arrived about 20 minutes later, followed by an ambulance and 2 more patrol cars. When the other officers saw the condition of the house and heard my account of what had happened, they immediately secured the scene and called for additional units. The first officer to respond saw the massive footprints around the house. His whole attitude changed. He'd been ready to joke about me shooting at shadows, but the physical evidence was impossible to ignore. The footprints were clearly visible in the soft mud, and they were definitely not made by any known animal. We spent the rest of the night documenting everything: the massive footprints around the house, the handprints on the windows, the damage to the front and back doors, the broken window in the kitchen, the destroyed porch furniture. We took photographs, made plaster casts of the clearest footprints, and measured everything we could find. The blood trail was the most disturbing evidence. We followed it about 100 yards into the forest before it disappeared on a rocky outcropping, but there was enough blood along the way to confirm that I'd definitely wounded whatever I'd shot at. The crime scene technicians collected samples, though I never heard what the lab results showed. What really bothered the other officers was the intelligence behind the whole incident. This wasn't random animal behavior. The creature had systematically examined the house, looking for ways to get inside. It had used tools, throwing the rock through the window, picking up the plow as a weapon. It had communicated with others of its kind. This was organized, deliberate behavior that didn't match any known animal species. As for the official report, well, that's where things got complicated. Nobody wanted to write down that a police officer had shot at an unidentified creature that matched descriptions of something that's supposed to be a myth. The incident was officially classified as an animal attack by an unknown species, with the shooting justified as defense of human life. Some of the other officers who responded that night were pretty skeptical about my story, especially the ones who arrived later and didn't see all the evidence firsthand. A few of them joked that I'd probably shot at a bear that was standing on its hind legs and let my imagination run wild. But the officers who saw the physical evidence, the footprints, the handprints, the way the front door had been damaged, the blood trail, they knew I was telling the truth about something unusual happening that night. I was placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation into the shooting. That's standard procedure whenever an officer discharges their weapon, regardless of the circumstances. I had to meet with internal affairs investigators, undergo multiple psychological evaluations, and provide detailed written statements about everything that had happened. The psychological evaluation was probably the worst part of the whole ordeal. The department psychologist kept asking me questions about stress, fatigue, and whether I'd been having any problems at home that might have affected my judgment. She wanted to know if I'd been drinking, if I was taking any medications, if I'd been getting enough sleep. I could tell she thought I was either lying or having some kind of mental breakdown. Here I was, an 11-year veteran officer with a clean record, telling her I'd shot at an 8-foot-tall creature covered in fur. From her perspective, it probably did sound like I was losing my mind. During the day, I couldn't stop thinking about the intelligence I'd seen in that creature's eyes. Most animal attacks are instinctual. A bear protecting its cubs, a mountain lion defending its territory, a dog that's been mistreated and turned aggressive. But this was different. The creature had looked at me like it understood exactly what was happening, like it had made a conscious decision to threaten me and was prepared to deal with the consequences. That level of intelligence in something that shouldn't exist was terrifying in a way that's hard to explain. It meant there were creatures out there that could think, plan, and remember. Creatures that might hold grudges, that might learn from their mistakes, that might come back for revenge when the opportunity presented itself. After 6 weeks of administrative leave and 3 more psychological evaluations, I was cleared to return to duty. But instead of going back to patrol, I was assigned to desk duty at the station. The official reason was that I needed time to readjust after a traumatic incident involving the use of deadly force. The real reason was that nobody wanted me responding to calls in heavily wooded areas in case I saw something else and had another shooting incident. The other officers treated me differently after I came back. Some of them were supportive and said they believed my story, especially the ones who'd seen the evidence at the scene that night. But others clearly thought I'd either made the whole thing up or had some kind of breakdown. I became known as the guy who shot at Bigfoot, and not always in a friendly way. Some of the younger officers would make jokes about bringing silver bullets on patrol or asking if they should watch out for werewolves in addition to the usual suspect. But the story didn't end that night at the farmhouse. Over the following months, there were more reports from the same general area, though most of them didn't make it into official police reports. Farmers started calling in about livestock being killed by something large. Not killed like a bear or coyotes would do it, but killed with precision, like whatever did it knew exactly what it was doing. The animals weren't eaten or dragged away like you'd expect with normal predators. They were just killed and left behind, almost like something was sending a message. One farmer found 3 of his cattle dead in a field, all of them killed by what appeared to be massive, blunt force trauma to the head. The veterinarian who examined them said the injuries were consistent with being struck by something incredibly strong, but he couldn't identify what kind of weapon or tool might have caused that kind of damage. A few hikers reported finding footprints in the mud along some of the hiking trails that run through the state forest. The tracks were always in soft ground where they'd show up clearly, and they were always much larger than human footprints. Some of them measured over 16 inches long, with a stride length that suggested whatever made them was much taller than any human. But what really got people's attention were the reports of trees being broken or pushed over in ways that didn't make sense. Not knocked down by wind or lightning, but twisted and snapped like something incredibly strong had grabbed them and bent them until they broke. Some of these trees were 8 or 10 inches in diameter, way too large for a human to break, and too deliberately damaged to be natural. The pattern that emerged was interesting. Most of the incidents happened within about a 10-mile radius of where I'd had my encounter with the creature. It was like there was a territory out there, and something was actively defending it from human intrusion. The closer people got to certain areas of the forest, the more likely they were to have unusual encounters. What really bothered me was the escalation. The early reports from years past were mostly about sightings or minor property damage. But after my shooting incident, the reports became more aggressive: livestock killings, deliberate property destruction, and what seemed like intimidation tactics aimed at keeping people away from specific areas. It was like whatever I'd shot that night had learned from the encounter and was now more aggressive in defending its territory. Or maybe there were more of them now, and they'd decided that humans were too much of a threat to tolerate in their area. What disturbs me most about these reports is the suggestion that there might be small populations of these creatures living in remote wilderness areas across the country. If that's true, then what I encountered wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern of contact between humans and something that science doesn't recognize as existing. Sometimes I wonder if I should have handled things differently that night. Maybe I should have tried to communicate with the creature instead of shooting it. Maybe if I'd shown that I wasn't a threat, it would have just left the area peacefully and the elderly couple would have been safe without anyone getting hurt. but then I remember the way it picked up that piece of farm equipment like it weighed nothing. I remember the intelligence in its eyes and the deliberate way it approached me. And I remember that there was an elderly couple counting on me to protect them from something they didn't understand and couldn't defend against themselves. I did what I was trained to do. I protected those people from what I perceived to be a legitimate threat. Whether that threat was human, animal, or something in between doesn't change the fact that I believed those people were in danger and I acted accordingly. Would I do the same thing again if I found myself in a similar situation? I honestly don't know. What I do know is that there are things in this world that we don't understand. Things that exist in the spaces between what we think we know about nature and reality. That's my story. Make of it what you will. I protected those people from what I perceived to be a legitimate threat. Whether that threat was human, animal, or something in between doesn't change the fact that I believed those people were in danger, and I acted accordingly. Would I do the same thing again if I found myself in a similar situation? I honestly don't know. What I do know is that there are things in this world that we don't understand, things that exist in the spaces between what we think we know about nature and reality. For more interesting stories like this, consider checking this.